All right, everyone. Welcome to round 3 of LSE Open. Great. I'll start with introductions. My name is Erasmus, and I'm the chair for this round, and judging with Grace. All right, wonderful. We'll take introductions from all of the teams. And starting with Tiffany.
Speaking first, today.
Second, Harish, the preference.
All right,
And speaking first, Dhruv,
Speaking second, Jason, either.
all right, CG.
Speaking first, Taha, no preference.
Hamza, second, no preference. Thank you.
Thank you. CEO.
Speaking first, please.
Your second, Xiao, please.
All right, wonderful.
There is a background noise.
That's so. All right, thank you very much. I'm sure the combined debate experience in this room should surpass 15 years, so we probably know all the rules. So I don't
just for each alone.
That's like 6 seconds. So I don't need to remind anyone about the rules, but I will try to keep time, try not to distract you, but anything after 7:15, we promise you will not be writing. All right, let's have a good debate. Let's invite the Prime Minister. Yeah.
Can I move this thing? Yeah. Yeah. I prefer if you have POIs, if you ask non-verbally. We are currently living in unprecedented economic times where, despite a crippling war and a brutal pandemic, energy companies have emerged victorious. Opening government is going to correct for this and make the world more fair. I'm going to start by describing what these policies look like and then talk about 2 things. Firstly, what this leads to a lot more money for governments and why that money is good. And secondly, what this assists the process of diversification. What do these policies currently look like? We're talking about windfall taxes that currently exist in countries like the UK, where a portion of the profits that companies are making, which occur during periods of high energy taxes, are being taxed very handsomely, and we support the continuation of this process. Note, the policies and how they exist are also combined with tax incentives for investment in green energy as well, and we support the continuation of that trend. First claim, why is more money a force for good? I want to characterize why this is a lot more money going to governments rather than just a small piece of cake. The first reason for this is that we have to acknowledge the massive amounts of profits that were made during the initial stages of the war in Ukraine. Oil was literally selling for over $120 a barrel, which is really double what it was selling a few years before. What this means is that profits were so excessive that the net budgets of these companies are extremely large. Secondly, in countries that have energy sectors and oil-producing industries, these companies are massively profitable. Oil is often a large portion of GDP, but even aside from that, we're talking about some of the richest companies in the world. Literally, ExxonMobil, by some estimates, has made over $300 billion a year. These are larger than entire sectors and entire industries that these states literally have, meaning that only a minor increase in taxation results in a cumulatively large amount of money given the sheer power of these companies. Why are these policies good? Firstly, on a humanitarian level. It is very important to recognize the context in which the current state of taxation is existing under. Governments are incredibly fiscally stressed. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, the COVID pandemic meant that businesses shut down. A lot of state money had to be spent on measures supporting small businesses and had to be spent on supporting households. The invasion worsened all of these trends by increasing the price of energy, which also created strains, but also harming export and supply chains that ultimately existed. As a consequence of this, there's 2 observations. The first, that governments need more cash in order to support their social safety nets, spending more money on the welfare state. The fact that small businesses still have lingering harms from the pandemic and therefore need increased degrees of support. But secondly, it's about lowering the harms of austerity policies as well and decreasing the necessity for them in the first place. Governments currently have higher debt to GDP ratios than they did before, so having an increased access to a form of funding is inherently stabilizing in terms of their ability to tap into international credit markets by lowering the perceived risk of investing within these states overall. And even when they do need to lend money, we'll get things like lower interest rates, and they can just spend more money having policies to offset some of the harms of mandated austerity policies that are ultimately existing under. I want to note here that the redistribution is not only utilitarianly practical, but it's also a moral necessity as well. I want to note that we don't think that energy companies have any more claim to wealth that was accrued during arbitrary circumstances any more than the average citizen does within these contexts, given that there is no way to morally distinguish the worth between persons. Therefore, we got redistribute money in a way that maximizes the quality of life of the average person rather than rewards those who are arbitrarily placed in a position of privilege. The second reason why more money is something that's so crucial is that we get better energy policy specifically. Yes, some money are going to other things like supporting the social safety net, but a lot of money that's generated from windfall taxes is being explicitly used to maintain low cost of energy for the average citizen within these states, specifically being combined with price caps. So governments are basically having price caps and having lower degrees of energy that are funded by these schemes, and the unique ability to sustain these schemes comes from energy taxes. This is for two reasons. Firstly, all of the framing about fiscal stress that I explained to you earlier means governments don't have a myriad of alternative revenue sources that they're able to tap into. There was a really essential revenue source for them to sustain things like price caps on energy. Secondly, though, the high interest rate environment that we currently exist under is to offset the cost of inflation means that it is harder for governments to take loans to otherwise keep this kind of policy because they're going to have to spend more money from those loans on interest payments. What this means that we are necessary in sustaining policies for cheaper energy. This is important for a few reasons. Firstly, it is beneficial for the individual citizen's quality of life who can literally afford to access heating in the winter rather than getting cold. Secondly, it's essential for businesses as well to use energy within their own production chain and therefore can produce cheaper goods. But thirdly, and most importantly, this is about sustained political will for sanctions and harsh measures against Russia. The world is currently standing behind Ukraine, but eventually people are going to get tired when they're becoming poor and when they're struggling to heat their homes. Having the ability to have sustained measures for cheap energy is a vital political tool in order to make it politically viable to get sustained tough measures against Russia. This is crucial because as the war reaches more of an equilibrium period where they're going to begin their spring offensive, this gives the West substantially more leverage over Russia when things like sanctions policies are remaining in place, meaning that a negotiated settlement is likely to be more favorable towards Ukraine. Before I get into our second argument about diversification, I'll take back after.
Look, we're obviously not going to argue that it's great for these companies to profit as much as they can. What we are going to argue is that this is not the best way to stop the profits, which by the way, push inflation even higher, the more you legitimize them raising their profits.
But like, how else do you stop profits than taxing them? And if you're going to argue that there's other ways to stop profits, that literally looks like you were debating for proposition in the motion. This is direct, it is targeted, and it harms companies who are profiting the most. How do we get diversification? The first piece of framing that I want to do here is why companies still have the money to diversify regardless. As in, I cannot make claims that these companies are now going to be financially stressed. The first trivial observation here is that this is only a windfall tax on companies that are already profiting. We are taxing their profits, we are not taxing their revenues. Energy companies who are financially stressed are not going to be subject to our policy. But more than that, energy companies have large capital reserves. The first reason for this is that they just made a lot of money, just given that oil is basically an inelastic thing. People need energy in order to survive, and therefore demand for that has been very high historically. But secondly, the kind of companies that we are discussing who are going to be subjected to the windfall tax are the kind of companies who have the cheapest production. Firstly, they occupied first generation oil fields, which had the easiest extraction processes. But secondly, their production processes have been equipped to and benefit the most from economies of scale that exist under the status quo. So these companies are mega rich. We're just like reducing two of the megas in the mega. They don't have the capacity to diversify regardless financially. Why do they have a higher incentive to under our side of the house? This is for two structural reasons. Firstly, we are shifting the relative profitability of different types of energy that companies are existing in. We can see that companies probably have a long run incentive to move into green energy regardless. This is not the incentive for all energy companies under the status quo. Why? It's often seen as being riskier. It requires initial investment. They already have their oil fields, and therefore their marginal incentive is to tap into that. But given the fact that we're only taxing windfall profits from oil in particular, we are not taxing forms of renewables, the marginal incentive now becomes to shift into more sustainable forms of production to avoid being subjected to windfall taxes that are going to exist into the future, and therefore we get more diversification within that capacity. Our second mechanism though for why we get more diversification is that state regulation of companies becomes easier. No, under our side of the house, we effectively create more competitive energy sectors because larger companies are the ones generating windfall profits, and therefore going to be asymmetrically subjected to increased levels of taxation. Therefore, you're likely to reduce the sheer bargaining power that ExxonMobil has relative to other companies. What this means is that it's more less likely that you're going to get political capture. You have the largest energy companies effectively paying off state regulators to resist pushes in order to get more moves to green energy overall. For all of these reasons, I'm extremely proud to stand in opening government.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. Would like to invite the leader of opposition to respond. Yeah.
I want to quickly note that these oil companies and gas companies aren't just money widgets, right? They don't sit on their money. I think probably what you do with this money, like any other corporation, is probably to redistribute in some form. That's to say, dividends, payouts through stocks, all these sort of things that I think are good, and I think to some degree mitigate this like principle of like these companies don't deserve arbitrary wealth. So I'm going to get engaged with that. Anyways, okay. First argument on why this is just an acceptable range of volatility and why that's both principally and practically important. That's to say that I think natural markets, especially oil markets like energy markets, tend to go up and tend to go down, right? That is to say that you don't know which way is which. You as a company who chosen to enter this industry have chosen to take on a significant level of risk, right? You could get screwed over by lower prices at some point, like has happened when oil went negative, and you also get to benefit when it goes up. Why do I think that's important? Because I think when you have made a significant choice to invest your own capital when there are massive amounts of risk at the out end, right? I think you deserve to have a privileged level of wealth at the end of it. What do I mean by this? Let's say you're an average individual, right? You study really, really hard, like go to like a good university, and at the end, they say, no, you don't actually deserve that diploma because that's a special level of wealth and a special level of selection. I don't think that's how the principle works, right? Because these companies have made unique contributions and unique investments, I think you ought to reward them for that risk. If they if they have to experience the downfall, then I think they also deserve to experience the upfall, right? Broadly, I think you have to accept from a certain level of risk. I think in this way we can distinguish between different different people, not just because they have different worths, but rather because they take on different levels of risk, different levels of investment. I think basically like if you invest in something, you get the payout. That's pretty intuitive. But on the practical, right? Why do I think it's like really helpful here? Basically on the competition, because I think currently there are very few emergent oil and gas companies for obvious reasons, right? High startup costs, all those sort of things. They're not really that much potential for new exploration in this field. But I do think that, no, thank you. And I think it's like really quite useful to have more of these companies, right? For a reason that I'll explain in a moment. The thing is, I think that in order to explore like a new oil field or a new gas field, you need massive levels of potential return in order to make that worth your while, right? I think Naomi themselves say that it's a really, really high risk for companies to do this, and therefore you need to incentivize them with large payouts, right? You need excess returns essentially, both to make it worth it in terms of risk, and secondly, just to finance the startup costs, because it is not cheap to build a new oil rig. It costs a lot of money, so you need a lot of excess profits in order to do this. Why is it so important that we allow new companies and new emergents in this space? For three reasons, right? I think one, if you have more new companies and smaller companies entering the space because they no longer fear a windfall tax and have the actual profit capacity to build new oil wells and things, that just increases competition, right? I think competition is a very good thing. If the goal of government is to lower prices and increase the accessibility of energy, then I think competition is a great way to do that. Yeah. Having more competitors, no thank you, will lower the price. But secondly though, right? Also note that you have people just really need energy right now. I think it's a good thing to be able to offer them more of a good that when people cannot heat their homes in the UK and in certain parts of the US, I think it's a really, really bad thing. I think we do have some sort of obligation to give them more money. No, thank you. And thirdly, by exploring new oil and gas fields, you just create more energy. You increase the supply curve of energy, which is innately going to lower the price. I think that makes it more accessible for all these reasons. I think that's a good thing. Before moving on, I'll take closing of that.
The vast majority of these windfall taxes do not apply to renewables. In the long run, people get cheaper energy that also doesn't kill the planet.
Yeah, okay, so I'll talk about renewables, my third argument, but basically, actually, I'll just talk about my third argument. I'll flag that when I get to it. Awesome. Second argument on why I think governments are probably going to be pretty bad at spending this money, and why, if that's the counterfactual that OG wants to argue on, then I think they lose this debate, right? Several reasons here. One, just because of politically important constituencies. Obviously, I think we all know that governments don't make perfect spending decisions because you as a government are a politician. You as a politician have one incentive, that is to win an election. How do you win an election? There are broadly three groups in any electorate, right? Those who are definitely going to vote for you, those who are definitely not going to vote for you, and those in the middle, the swing states, so to say. I think that you as a politician are then intelligently going to use all the money that you accrue through this windfall tax on spending on these arbitrary populists. If you want to use OG's analysis here, I think people deserve equal worth, right? I think they deserve equal levels of money. So I don't see why it's fair in this case to arbitrarily give this group, who just happens to have more diverse political beliefs, arbitrary levels of money. But I also think it's really just bad, right? I don't think it's going to help solve a lot of the economic problems if a lot of the money that you're shoveling in isn't necessarily to solve economic problems or to help the most needy, but rather just to help those who are arbitrarily in swing state populations, in these sort of things. Also note that because this is a particularly tumultuous period, I don't think there's a lot of government oversight right now, right? Especially because these are quite opaque measures, where you do individual levels of government spending doesn't have a lot of oversight checks. No one's looking at where exactly the federal budget is going. That's why I think there's also going to be bad incentives. We need people to have the money. They don't do it. But secondly, I think governments are broadly short-termist for pretty intuitive reasons, right? Political incentives, you need to win the next election, which means that you're going to focus on trying to win the next election by spending accordingly, right? That means that you're not going to invest in long-run projects. Rather, you're just going to invest in the short run, which makes it look good for your political populists who are then going to vote for you. No, thank you. What that means is, like on the comparative, basically, right? Because obviously they can say, but we don't spend the money in any good ways. Look, broadly, as I said earlier, this like a profit isn't just sitting in some bank account, right? It goes to people through dividends, it goes to people through stock holdings, it goes to people through all these sort of things. Why do I think that's better? Because I think regular people tend to make better spending decisions, right? That's to say, if you have a problem the government wants to solve, I fail to see why someone who is more proximate to the problem and who has a greater like knowledge of the problem cannot make a better spending decision when they receive the money through their pensions, through their dividend, on how to resolve that problem. If what they want to do is spread money to the populations, I think we do it in a far more beneficial manner. Moving on to my third argument, why profits are broadly helpful to the people. I think this broadly like clashes exactly with what Naomi was saying. First argument here on like stabilizing portfolios, because I think oil and gas is obviously like a really major resource that people tend to think is stable, tend to have like major investments from a lot of like a variety of funds, things like pensions, right? It's the fundamental basis of the economy. That's why I think, especially if you have a diversified portfolio, obviously you're going to use some of that diversification to go into the energy space. What does that look like? It looks like, you know, holding these sort of stocks in mutual funds. It looks like pension funds investing in them. It looks like regular people, regular elderly people relying on it for their retirement to ensure that they get their dividend. Why is it so important then that we don't impose this windfall tax out of order? Because I think at this point, you need to make sure these people who are relying on you to like have their livelihood basically made don't have their profits arbitrarily taken away from them, right? Also note that because the market is so volatile at this point, if you impose this windfall tax and if you continue imposing windfall taxes, I think that has like an outsized harm on like stock prices, right? Because people are panicking, that's going to cause like an overly sensitive decrease in like the price of stocks, which is probably a bad thing because these people are relying on it for their own well-being. I think it's a really bad thing to do. Finally, talking about green innovation, while we get better on our side, right? Broadly, I think these companies are probably going to invest in green innovation for a lot of the obvious reasons, right? Research and development is common. I think they know that this is a dying industry. They eventually need to like transition to green if they want to survive. Secondly, there's this first mover advantage, so each company wants to be doing this. And thirdly, like we're increasingly incentivized by things like tax breaks, which are non-exclusive, but I think happen on our side as well. They have a unique capacity to do this on our side because one, you need large levels of profit to get over like the sort of like levels of profit you need to like pay out dividends and stuff. We need them to like be expanding into new like massive levels of innovation that require significant startup costs and require significant returns on risk, right? So I think on our side, we get better levels of innovation by the companies who are uniquely qualified to do so. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. Let's invite the Deputy Prime Minister to
Yeah.
First, why is this policy justified, which seems to be part of the attack we get from opening opposition? I would note several things. First, they want to claim there's acceptable volatility in prices. I just don't think this is true because it doesn't understand how energy companies actually operate. What would you do as an oil company when prices were very low? You don't simply provide energy or oil at that price. You instead store it. You store it in your barrels, you store it in your warehouses, and as a result, you push prices further up. That is why these companies still make reasonable profits at all times, and they make supernormal profits at other times. In other words, what they are doing is that even in periods of low profitability or low prices, they are manipulating the market in order to ensure that they maintain reasonable amounts of profit. And just using the intuition code, that is exactly what OPEC or OPEC Plus does. That isn't an energy company per se, but the same kind of thinking, that you change the supply conditions and what you offer to the market during periods where prices are low. Secondly, why is this justified? We gave you 3 reasons which they never responded to. First, we made a utilitarian claim that there is no reason why these companies need to matter anymore. No, there's no response to that. But second, it is unclear to me why they deserve higher profits just because the random fact they were an oil company with a license which is granted them by the state in a period of unprecedented crises, particularly vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. What is their moral right to be able to gain supernormal profits during those periods? Thirdly, that these are the companies which particularly don't deserve it because the externalities of their behavior. some we'll talk about later. Just want to highlight, for instance, the pollution caused by the kinds of actions which are taking place right now. That we think there's a reciprocal obligation then that we are allowed to tax them more than other companies. And as those costs rise and the environmental costs rise, I don't think it's unreasonable as to limit their profitability. And if they really think companies have a God-given right to level of profitability they would have, do they believe you can't change corporation tax rates? Do they believe you can't have tax incentives for certain kinds of companies? Do they even oppose, for instance, increasing the rate or tax people have to pay at the petrol pump, which de facto reduces the profitability these companies make? Secondly, where does the money go? Now, we told you the money could be used in lots of areas, but one specific area where lots of this money was used for. And I sort of give you a little bit of a memory jog about a year ago. What was happening? Why did we introduce these caps? Why did we introduce these new taxes? It's because governments realized the number one issue voters were facing, whether your own voters in the middle, was the price of energy. Opening up tells us perfectly. It's about whether you can heat your home. That is the determinative issue for almost every single individual. But there weren't other easy ways of being able to fund it, particularly then. So obvious reasons for that. Mass fiscal overhang and spending overhang from the COVID crisis. The difficulty in actually getting affordable debt as interest rates continuously go up. That is why energy price cap was one of the most important issues which we're going to focus on. The analysis the other side gives us to this, beyond just, look, you want to support your constituency, I think you probably also want to get support from everyone, and those people in the middle and your own constituency will care about energy price caps. Then they say governments are short-termist. Okay, if that is true, they spend money on energy price caps and reduce austerity. That's probably good. I don't think governments even are that short-termist in the first place. One of the reasons is, think about a government. Yes, you have a prime minister, a few people at the top. They might be short-termist. But how about everyone else in that government? The person who wants to be still in politics 10 years from now, there are other people in government who go, I want to be prime minister. If the current Conservative government say is to totally ruin the economy as they were, that harms everyone else in the party and other important decision makers in cabinet, and you probably can't even get it past a legislature. That's why governments aren't even as short-termist as they suggest. And let me just stress the importance of this. Something they didn't even decide to mention or engage with, which is it wasn't just beneficial because it helps consumers, but the impact of that was literally support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. It significantly impacts the ability and willingness of Europeans to continue, particularly Europeans, to continue to support that when they otherwise could get cheaper energy, or they don't feel that they are having austerity imposed on them, and therefore they are less likely to demand very significant changes to policy. Now, I don't mean that they can change their support or lift all sanctions immediately. There's obviously a spectrum here. What that could easily mean is support for very rapid negotiations, for reducing some of these sanctions, for not having other kinds of measures which would otherwise be in place. That is the significant impact of this argument. The final thing I want to talk about is what happens in the long term. And there is two claims-ish from the opposition here. The first claim is we need these companies to make a huge amount of money so that they can get more oil or have more, drill for more oil or gas. I don't think we actually want that. And there's a couple obvious reasons. One is environmental. And we definitely don't want people to be putting more and more money into oil and gas versus green tech. But secondly, just look at the analysis they give you, which is it is really useful that people have cheap sources of energy. That is not an argument for new oil rigs, where you have to discover it, put the oil in, start drilling, and then market that. That is like a 10 to 15-year process, probably doesn't lead to cheap oil right now. The stronger claim on this, which we've already talked about, is the impact on green tech and the changing incentives which companies actually face. And there's a couple of things which we noted on this. One, what's the marginal change in incentives here? We note that you now have a greater risk of taxes, the money you're getting from oil, but a reduced set of taxes, at least comparatively, the money you get from green tech. That is because the way these policies were designed, just a common sense reason. When these policies were implemented, don't you think economic conservatives, whether that be Homage, the Conservative Party in the UK, from the CDU in Germany, or even newspapers like the FT and Wall Street Journal noted this problem, that if you just tax them and you don't have tax breaks, there will otherwise be a potential decrease. So as a result, you have tax incentives or reduced tax rates for green tech gains. Why does that matter? One, because these companies already have some money that can invest more, but second, the marginal change in the potential profitability of oil investment or gas investment versus green tech investment is significantly different. And I agree with opening up. There are already incentives for you to do it. We want to increase those incentives so you end up doing it considerably sooner than you otherwise would. Why is that? But further to that, we tell you about the regulatory environment. It also makes it easier to pass these kinds of measures on companies going forward as they do become weaker, but they're no longer the ones making hundreds of billions of dollars or the most valuable companies in the world. That is when it is easier for you to be able to regulate these companies. It is when that is a huge benefit. It makes it easier to put these kinds of policies in place without the barriers which would otherwise exist. At the end of this debate, this is a justified policy. The money helps individuals and in particular can help can improve continue support for Russia. And in the long term, this is beneficial for green tech. We're very happy to propose.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. We will invite the dealer to close up the topic.
To be clear with the comparison in this debate, proposition believes that if you put the money in the coffers of a government, it may be used to help with cost of living crisis. And indeed, Dhruv and I will say some of that money will go to solving that cost of living crisis. The critical distinction on the comparative is how much of that money goes there. We noted that there are politically affluent constituencies, that when you satisfy enough people with this money, then afterwards you're going to allocate that funding to politically affluent groups. On our side of the house, the difference is very simple. The money comes through in the term in dividends and also in terms of green energy reinvestment. The dividends come and help everybody. And notably, not just people located in a country where there's a lot of oil, but everyone in the world who has invested in them, which is pretty much everyone who has a pension. This is a far fairer distribution of money, and their side completely ignores the fact that we get a more certain and fair distribution as a whole. 3 issues to talk about. First, was it reasonable for companies to make these profits? Second of all, who distributes this money better? Lastly, on Russia. First, was it reasonable? The first thing that I want to begin with is just explaining why it is the case this was not profiteering in case closing government stands up and tries to claim it was, and to preempt any closing opposition material that might come out about how you can shift prices now. Because the reason why is this is a competitive market. It is pegged to a barrel of oil, and everybody knows that price of oil because it's in a global financial market. There are dozens of players, perhaps not enough, and we could have more competitors, but there's still a competitive aspect, even if it could be more competitive. This means that prices stay relatively stable because there's clear transparency about what those prices are, there are clear global markers, and there's competition to not form a cartel. Now, in terms of this observation, what this then means is that these companies have done nothing malicious in making these profits. It is just incidental that they made more profits because of these circumstances. We told you about the enterprise risk. And crucially, what is more arbitrary? Living in a country that has oil companies and can make millions of dollars, or the fact that you might be a citizen who lives in a state who now gets dividends from that profit. More importantly here, as a crucial observation here, this means that their side of the house doesn't actually fix the arbitrariness problem. In fact, it is actually making it worse because we think many of these companies have actually gone upon a risk in order to invest in this company and deserve a reward as a consequence. Harish has 2 different responses. First of all, is this a reason to not increase corporate tax? The difference is this: you are specifically being targeted. When tech companies during COVID did well and had supernormal profits, they weren't targeted. The problem is the inconsistency on how you treat the property right and how you derive the right of the individual company. Then they say you just store the oil, and that means that you're able to make profits later on. I think that this is sometimes true, but not always true. Think about circumstances in which, for instance, energy is high demand. In the winter, other kinds of scenarios in which you're rapidly going to go through your supplies and your stores. Notably here, if this is true that you stored all this oil, I actually think most of their environmental benefits or long-term benefits are going to be mitigated because that means a large amount of it has been extracted far in advance regardless. No thanks. What did we tell you here as a secondary implication? We told you about monopolies. We told you about decreasing prices in the long run. We concede maybe prices will be slightly shorter in the short or higher in the short run. We think the long term of 15 to 20 years matters far more. We told you about energy security and having more sources of energy so you no longer are dependent on Russia. None of that explicitly engaged with. At the bottom of this argument, there is a property right that these companies deserve. We think it is unfair to tax them, and doing so deters more companies from entering in. On the second argument about whether or not money gets distributed better, as I've already noted, yes, some of the money is going towards a cost of living crisis. The question here is the relative distribution and whether or not this is an optimal distribution given the comparative that I've already outlined. What we told you was twofold. First of all, that powerful constituencies are going to take up an excess amount of that profit. And second of all, that short-termism means that most of these governments are not going to care about green energy or reinvest into these problems. The responses from Harish note that some of the money will go to the cost of living crisis. It does not negate our point. It does not disprove this idea. No thanks. The next thing that comes from this, given that the money gets distributed better, is how this affects green energy. Because I think part of this question of distribution is the long-term benefit here. On green energy, yes, these companies are mega rich. But Naomi herself tells you how risky it is to enter into this field, that your technology may not pan out, that your technology may be less optimal than other competitors, that other competitors get to the market first. All of those are reasons why it is immensely risky to go into the green energy field. This means that you need a significant amount of profit in order to be able to finance and invest in that. Naomi says mega rich isn't what you need. I counter assert you do need to be mega rich, and you can't just say those phrases in order to disprove the analysis. What they say is that they more crucially alter the incentive because windfall taxes will not apply to green energy. First of all, think about the justification of this policy. Do you know what politicians are going to say? There's a cost of living crisis. They've been profiteering off of the citizens. The almost explicit purpose of this policy is going to be one in which you're trying to redistribute money. It has nothing to do with whether or not it's renewable or gas, which means that because of the specific context of this policy, it doesn't indeed make companies feel as if going into green energy may be less attractive, given the fact that you still have a windfall tax, and the profits are taxed, mean that the efficiency gains you get from technological innovation are diminished because the efficiency that you have is explicitly taken away. Harish.
They don't need to believe all the money is used for good. Rather going to, at the very best, middle class or rich investors abroad and domestically, a good amount for the reasons we told you about the salience of energy prices will be spent on these positive gains, which do win you political support, particularly in the short term.
Yes, I agree. The problem is the comparative. We say better money or more of the money is spent well on our side of the house, where it's directly redistributed to citizens through dividends and through green energy investments by the companies. I don't contest your claim, I outweigh it. So the crucial reason why this green energy argument matters so much is because the harms of oil are not just on oil prices, but those who have been displaced from the extraction of oil. And their policy only disproportionately benefits a small subsection of people, most of them who have actually benefited from oil being so high, while completely disregarding those who have been hurt in foreign countries, while we rectify that better because we solve for green energy and we also redistribute these dividends more globally. The last thing on Russia. And here I just want to note that bonds are easy to access for most countries because they are a government. It is very unlikely that most governments are going to default. This might be a reason why there's a high debt to GDP ratio, but this is also going to prove that you don't need to be reliant on Russia because you can just borrow more money, right? The fact that you don't feel fatigued by sanctions, most politicians will believe fighting against Ukraine matters more than taking out some debt. In contrast, on our side of the house, we get more energy independence. And of course, there might be an environmental harm in the short run from more oil fields being investigated, but green energy needs to be developed and ready first before we can stop that dependency. But in the short to medium term before that happens, we have more independence from Russia. And yes, maybe this is in 10 to 15 years. That is still a benefit because we don't know what sort of risk they will pose in the long run. On weighing, the question here is simple. Do you prefer the certain benefits of redistributing these dividends to regular people and getting investment, or do you care about the uncertain benefits that come from government incentives? Very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. That ends the talk about the debate. To begin the closing out, we'd like to invite the member of government here.
I'll discuss three things in this speech. One, I'm going to talk about why governments are going to be great at spending this money, which I think sort of breaks the clash between OG and OO about where this money is going, whether it's going to be well spent. The second thing I'm going to talk about is instead of renewable investments made by oil and gas companies, I'm going to talk about institutional investors and the signaling effect of this tax. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is potentially maybe some stuff around the principle and why this is justified. Before all of that, I think there's two key pieces of framing that you need to do to take sort of OO out of this debate. I think the first thing you need to understand is governments need the money. That's just there. There are two potential options here. either as OG suggests, you have to go into slashing spending and austerity. I would posit governments will probably not want to go down this route because that is, that's a quick one-way ticket to getting out of power. Or there is the second alternative, which is either you raise taxes on other industries or you raise direct taxes on consumers, which I would suggest either makes the lives of the consumers much worse, but I would also posit that we are in a period of recession. So it probably leads to the death of lots of industries or lower profitability in other industries and in general. The point there then is there is vast economic suffering on the other side of the house. So any distribution that these guys do through, I don't know, like pension funds probably gets fucked at the point at which other industries are going out of business. Now, swiftly moving on to why governments are going to be good at spending this money and why there's a degree of accountability, our extension material. I would posit that the first thing that happens once this tax is raised is that there is a lot of talk about this because this is an immensely political issue. Nida suggests that oil and gas companies have massive lobbies. And they also have things like, right-wing think tanks who publish papers, who show up on news shows or talk shows. They have politicians who they back, who oftentimes come out against these taxes. There is going to be a lot of pushback at the point at which you increase this tax for a longer period of time. You will have the same right-wing propaganda that, oh, this is going to lead to so many jobs being lost, or, oh, this is sort of the loss that's going to happen. I would suggest that there is crucial scrutiny on how the government is spending this money that wasn't present before because the government literally did not have that fucking money. The second thing I would note is, as Naomi suggested, there's a large pool of money that you have now because the profits of oil and gas companies are considerable. I would suggest that this raises levels of, just expectations about what standards of life are going to look like once this money does come in. So it raises expectations of the citizenry as well. But I would also note in terms of framing this point that the money that we are talking about, money that's going into welfare schemes or money that's going to housing or heating or education or all of those issues, these are primary voter issues. These are not issues that are ancillary to you. These are issues that you vote on. At the point at which these are directly related to your standard of life and your standard of living, I would posit that a lot of people care. Now, I would also posit that governments have what is called a re-election incentive, which is why governments have an incentive to spend this money better than they have in the past. This is not the same situation. Governments are on the brink of recession, and if they want to keep their hold on power, they have additional incentives to keep this going on. Now, I would also just add in like stuff that OO comes up with and OG responses here. Now, OO says governments are going to be really shit at spending this money because they're only going to send it to politically affluent constituencies. I just want to do a very basic way up here. Politically affluent constituencies or politically powerful constituencies have poor people. Poor people do not have pension funds. So if their mechanism of distribution is literally pension funds or dividends, I would say that the vast majority of your citizenry does not have access to those. As opposed to, even if this money goes first to politically powerful constituencies, at the very least, it reaches vulnerable people that this money would not have gone to otherwise. In terms of impact, we at the very least impact very vulnerable stakeholders that their policy can never ever impact and probably will make things worse. As I point out at the top of my speech, other industries probably die out, they slash jobs and so on and so forth. This is extremely important in that scenario. But the second thing I would note is that governments don't only want to retain constituencies. At the point at which you're in recession, winning over other constituencies is also easier at the point at which you say, we are the Tories and we know that this is fucking Liverpool, but at this point, we are the ones providing you with heating and we are the ones that are providing you with welfare. You know why? Because we're taxing oil companies. I would suggest that you get a lot more political sway in constituencies where you were historically a lot weaker. So governments have a very strong incentive of actually using this money for basic good, just because of their re-election incentive. But the third thing I would point out is, I'll take you later, Jason. The third thing I want to point out is it just gives you room for policy experimentation. This is not, I know this is a one-time policy, but at the point at which another recession is about to hit, and I don't know, the tech industry is booming or other industries are booming, this allows you to, at the very least, create a precedent to start taxing those those industries for windfall taxes in the future as well, which I would suggest is a good thing because it gives something for poor people to fall back on in those instances. You do not have to deal with the same kind of rhetoric coming from the right wing, which is you raise taxes, you slash jobs, because we all know that these companies have enough profit to keep those jobs there. Nobody is slashing that because Shell just made the highest profits they ever did in their 115-year history last year. So I don't reckon that they're going to lose jobs. If anything, this is a very profitable market. They're going to expand their stuff. I'm moving on to the next one, but yes, Susan.
If it's true we need more spending and that windfall taxes disproportionately hurt some companies through the public detriment, why don't you just take out bonds and accept a slightly higher debt to GDP ratio?
But because you could go into recession, like why would you want to accept something that is going to lead you to lead you to losing voters at some stage? I just don't know why that's something that governments want to do. But the second thing I want to talk about is institutional investments into new companies. The context over here is it is a tough market and it is volatile right now in terms of investors. Private equity funds and hedge funds aren't going out willy-nilly and dishing out cash. They're streaming it in. McKinsey is finally losing jobs. In terms of this, there's things that happen in the renewable sort of space in OO and OG. OG says, well, all companies will diversify, but I think OO is sort of fair in saying, well, they have a long-term incentive in diversification anyways. They get tax incentives right now, even apart from the windfall thing anyways, so they're probably already going into that. So it's unclear what the bigger marginal impact is. Even if the impact is there, it's sort of marginal. They're already doing it. I would point out in the short term, right now, this is great for institutional investors like private equity funds, which are, again, losing money or don't have very profitable industries to go into right now. I would suggest that this benefits a lot of ancillary industries. So I'm talking about lithium-ion battery manufacturers or potentially new companies coming in who want to, I don't know, create an electric car or something like that, because you know that there is a higher return on profit. And I know that both OO and OG have sort of said that this is sort of a risky space to invest in. I don't know, like the users, it's not risky. Like you get a lot of money if you come back into renewables anyway. So I would posit that this leads you there. But why is the short-term investment crucially important? Because I would suggest that private equity funds have a lot of money, and secondly, that money in the short run would not have gone there had the signaling effect would not been there, because private equity funds were probably thinking, they've extended this tax. Will they extend it again? The rates of profitability have fallen down. So the lack of certainty around this means that they're unlikely to do that, which they will in our world. For all those reasons, very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. Would like to invite the member of the session to begin a program.
Is everyone ready? Yeah. I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. Let's be very clear. All government bench, including OG, who actually brings the case, and CG, who mostly repeats the mechanization, regardless of what Hamza backloads and whip speech, is dependent on this tax outweighing the harm of the rising prices. We agree with the government bench that the government needs money. The question is whether the money will be spent well. The way we will firstly extend an opening opposition is we will show why this policy is shit, even if there are no perverse government incentives, no short-term government incentives. The government wants the best for us. It's still going to be absolutely shit for 3 reasons. Firstly, the very reason closing government gives us. There are politicians being lobbied by corporations. There are ideological differences within parliament. People who want to advocate, like opening opposition does, for market freedom and letting the market solve. This proves to us it's a long and protracted bureaucratic process. It took fucking Croatia 7 months to impose policies like this. The reason being that we have a pro-market government and an anti-government opposition. The problem with that being it happens significantly a posteriori to the harm of rising energy prices, which opening government says is so urgent. Secondly, and more importantly, energy prices are the main driver of inflation within the entire economy. So it's not just the price of heating that rises, because energy is an intermediary good in any form of production, which means that all forms of consumer goods and durable goods also rise, ranging from food to everyday appliances to anything you can find in a fucking supermarket, which means that even if the energy redistribution opening government talks about what happens, it only mirrors one part of the inflation. The majority is still there, and people have rising price at the end of the day. What is the context of this, and why does this outweigh opening government? Because their policy is the one that causes the problem. You're sending a signaling effect to corporations that they can raise their prices as much as they want. Yes, you're going to tax them, but you're not going to cap their profit, which is to say, you enter into an infinite spiral where companies continue to raise their prices over and over again, which is to say that you increase prices for consumers overall, which not only directly outweighs the harm to citizens from opening government, but it also makes the governments need more money, which is one of the primary problems that the opening government wants to solve, because there is nothing preventing these corporations from utilizing the current market situation to drive the market price, because the market price is nothing else than an implicit consensus between corporations on the market. It's not externally set. But thirdly, note that windfall taxes are levied on the corporation, not on its financial activities, which means there's a huge amount of loopholes the corporations can use to simply avoid this tax. Stuff like subsidiaries, stuff like shell companies, tax havens. If anything else, it's a very good incentive to shift your headquarters out of the country, which means that a lot of the things that opening government wants to happen, even if we have good incentives from the government on opening opposition, it's simply not going to happen. I have proven proven, firstly, that even in the best case government scenario, the harm will exist and the policy is bad, but they've also proven why the policy directly makes the harms worse, going a step further than opening opposition. Now, secondly, and let me make very clear what our path to victory is in this debate. We are going to take the government ground. Assume that both of the government teams win the clash on whether it's principally justified. Even within that context, on a strategically beneficial scenario for government, we're going to show that the realistic counterfactual is better than the one that the government has set up, therefore achieving victory on the government's own metric. What is the most likely reasonable alternative, simply empirically based on facts, that's going to happen if we don't have a windfall tax? It's things like price caps and profit caps. They have been empirically set up all over the European Union by countries like Germany. Why is this the case? Well, for reasons that both government teams give us, because people don't want to be called that there's bipartisan political capital. Closing government said it's very proximate to you, which is something that everybody votes on because people want to have lower prices. Therefore, there is capital for some kind of regulation. The question of this debate, empirically, factually, outside of debate world, the world's manual or whatever, is what happens absent this policy. If this is the alternative that happens absent this policy and we prove it's better, we win this debate. Why is it a better alternative? Firstly, because it provides benefits directly to citizens, i.e., I directly pay less for energy regardless of how good the government is at redistributing money. Secondly, it a priori stops the inflation spiral because it caps the price at a certain level, meaning that the government does not need more money in the long term to make up for the higher prices that are happening and the higher inflation that's happening. But thirdly, because it is targeted at sales, not the legal person, which means it targets everything sold to you at any point, which is the policy is far more far-reaching. Which is to say, the alternative we have in the counterfactual is one that is far more direct, that is far more implementable, and does not cause the problem in the way that the opening government and closing government case does. Before I move into a bunch more of responsive work, I'll take Harish.
Opening opposition tell us the market is sufficiently competitive that prices will not rise as everyone knows the cost of a barrel of oil. You tell us prices will rise significantly. Who's wrong and why?
No, I'm telling you, opening opposition runs a very good case and should probably win over both government teams. I'm also telling you that assuming that you win the path to opening opposition, I can run that ground as well. I'm perfectly allowed to do that. I'm sure you, Harish, know that. Cool. A couple of other pieces of responsiveness. Firstly, on the weird Russia-Ukraine point, there's 4 reasons why we still have support for war against Russia. Firstly, because there is a vast fear of nuclear war all across Europe. Ever since World War II, apart from the Balkans, and nobody cares about the fucking Balkans, there's not been a war on the European Union's borders. Countries like the Baltic states, Poland, Moldova, etc., have history of being occupied by Russia. The alternative is potentially dying if Ukraine as the frontier falls, and if people are willing to accept that cost. But secondly, as the government themselves concede, there is urgency to push for renewables because we have to diversify our sources because Russia won't sell anymore. There is subsidies being offered by the European Union to do that, which is to say the cost is probably going to shift in the long term. But thirdly, there's path dependency. At the point where you do implement sanctions, where you do put the cost on the people, you have to show something to make good for it. At the end of the day, you have to be able to say, we were able to bankrupt Russia's war machine. We were able to attrition them into losing. At the point where you've imposed those costs, that's when you're not going to go back on them, even if the people don't support it. So I'm not sure why you lose support for the war in Ukraine or why you lose those sanctions. I also want to respond to the green energy point, right? And this is where we tilt the scales and where we, break the deadlock. Because is it risky? Is it not risky? Blah, 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 blah. Here's the thing. There is a particular political junction in the situation where there is a push for green energy, not necessarily because people like it, but because they're being forced into it. I.e., you can either diversify your sources by now buying gas from Iran or Azerbaijan or Qatar or any other actor who has the incentive to ramp up the price because they know you have no alternative, or you have the incentive to become self-sustainable by shifting to renewables through things like subsidies for green energy. Insofar as that incentive exists, I'm not sure why the government wants to slow down the process by allowing companies to have unrealistically high profit margins despite the realistic need to shift towards renewable energy. At the point where we have a situation where we can justify shifting to renewables through the lens of securitization, through the lens of we might not like it, but we have no alternative, through the lens of it's a geopolitical tool against Russia. We have all the political capital we need, and government wants to impose a policy that's going to let companies artificially have their profit margins on the other side of the debate, and we're not going to use this particular junction we have now. Note how slow the shift has been despite Paris and Kyoto. If we don't use this opportunity to justify it through other means, we don't know when we get that opportunity again. And that's why they lose out the debate on renewable energy for all of these reasons closing opposition.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. We'd like to invite the government once one after the debate.
Sorry, just first, can I want to start?
No.
Sorry.
Thank you. It's something I have to live down rather live up to, but that's the good thing. My brightness one, please. Yeah, I'm going to take it over, right? One second. Great. As a great orator, Tin was able to kiss Harish's ass and diss Taha in the same sentence. I'm going to show you the legitimate things that Taha did say, because this happens quite a lot. Number one, Taha is the first person to break the clash on this money being used responsibly. Because if the opening government pushes, we get lots of money, and opening opposition pushes that they are more legitimate and effective forms of redistribution, then logically, the team which wins the debate is a team which shows that this money is much more likely to be effectively used. Taha gives two broad structural reasons for this, which are broadly conceded for the means of opposition's extension. Number one, you have lots of astroturf organizations set up by these oil companies, Americans against oil taxes, all of that stuff. You have right-wing politicians, you have right-wing op-eds, you have right-wing think tanks, which are going after this government as silly and as ineffective, but most of all pointing out that if cost of living is the name of the game, this is the worst way to do it. If that is true, there's heightened levels of scrutiny upon this government to use this money in immediate and effective ways to swing a voting public, which, as both sides have discussed, are reasonably polarized within this discussion. I think this is an incredibly important point in terms of impacting opening government's analysis and also being invulnerable to opening opposition's response on this money not being used effectively. Secondly, I think it does a great job of also responding implicitly to Tin's point about this idea of you could have regulated them instead, or you could have done something else. One, fairly world school's understanding of how political capital works, right? Like, there's a box of political capital, it's 100 political capitals. And we can use 100 political capitals to do policy X, which is us, or 100 to do yours, which is policy Y. One, that's never how policy works, because what often happens is you take an inch and then you take a mile. This is exactly what happened in the Wall Street crisis. This is exactly what happened with crypto 4 months ago at my detriment. And this is exactly what's going to happen right now, which is the point at which you say, fuck off, we're going to impose a windfall tax. Lots of people start saying, why are these people making $40 billion a year? Why is ExxonMobil making $300 billion of revenue? More and more and more people start coming out against it. This is why historically legislation gets more and more intense once they start going after a target, because it becomes more and more unpopular. If anything, our government would be accused of hypocrisy by subsidizing an industry that they're now taxing. We say go after the subsidies, which is exactly what people are saying in the pages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which is that if you have a windfall tax, then logically you shouldn't be subsidizing this industry through tax breaks of $1 trillion. We think we get much more change in our world, the point at which people accuse this government of this hypocrisy and of this incompetence, and hence get much more regulation in our world. Second, I think it's important to understand that diversification incentives exist on both sides. I think opposition bench has done a great job of being like, yeah, the 10 reasons why diversification would happen. Opening government's like, but there's a couple more. And I'm like, fair enough. I think the way that Taha breaks the clash is by talking about signaling and policy expectations, which is realistically how companies make decisions. What will the government do next is exactly what an investor is thinking at any given time, just like with inflation expectations. For instance, in this case, if the government continues this increase as Rishi Sunak is debating this in parliament for the last 2 weeks, then it signals to institutional investors that this is something that the government might do for a long amount of time. What this means then is that the signaling to the market shifts capital away from things like this, the lithium ion and ion batteries and different things, which helps the renewable push. Again, a very crucial mechanism in terms of proving the broader push for renewable energy. I think that's super, super important. But third, Jason comes up and says, you know what, like, why didn't we tax those tech companies when they made all that money in 2020? Thank you, because we want to set a precedent. We want to set a precedent for windfall taxes, the point at which if companies are making arbitrary gains out of circumstances that were no longer in their control, I think it sets up a real political discussion about when you should have windfall taxes in the future. And in fact, we compound the benefits on opening government, where we say the next time tech arbitrarily makes money because we're sitting at home because of a pandemic again, we should windfall tax them. And we should take that gain and distribute it equitably and fairly. And finally, just on this Ukraine point, I think it's important to understand, like, there's 100 reasons to be in Ukraine. I really don't think it's a debate world argument to say this will be the reason that people don't do it. I agree with both OG and O. I have nothing to say on that. Quickly on closing opposition then. First, I've showed you that this political capital argument is vulnerable to two responses. One, political capital is not mutually exclusive in this case, but two, governments are further accused of hypocrisy. There's a second claim that Tin makes, which is the claim about rising energy prices. And the hidden claim within that is on whom will the incidence of the tax fall? Two reasons why it will fall on the company and not the consumer. Number one, governments have, and in many cases are, instating price caps. It's specifically to ensure that the incidence of the tax won't fall on the consumer. But secondly, and structurally, I say, there's an overall rise of negative public sentiment against these companies to begin with, right? Like imagine that the government taxes them, and then the next day you're like, wow, oil was $3.50 in Arizona last night, and now it's $4.50. People aren't fucking stupid, and they're watching that change happen. That the more Shell is taxed, the more they take you for their money. Before I engage with opening opposition, I'm going to take Jason. Go ahead.
Where polarization and scrutiny occurs the very most, opponents will always invent a problem with your budget and critique the government regardless. Why does this mean that you always want to create the best possible budget when you'll always be critiqued and always be attacked in a polarized context like you suggest?
They want to get elected. Yeah, that's the one. Because what happens is when you're running these close races, and when you're taking a big risky move like a fucking windfall tax, this policy might be the reason you win or lose an election. Which means that you have to ensure that the next day there's something happening in Liverpool or Manchester, which shows the gains from this risky policy. Opening opposition, a couple of claims. One, the argument from legitimate wealth. A, they said you worked for it. You work to do lots of bad things in society, but if there's a third party harm on someone, you do not deserve that wealth. Secondly, it's important to understand that this wealth was not directly gained. If I work and get a PhD from Harvard and then I win the lottery the next day, one does not have to do with the other. That's why this wealth is not legitimate. Second, taking out all of their fancy economic analysis, boiling down their argument on redistribution to a sentence. Rise in oil company profits are a more effective form of distribution than the government. I think that's insane. I'm going to rebut it, but I think that's categorically insane. And I don't think they should be allowed to get away with that for a couple of reasons. One, the government has electoral incentives to ensure that they use this well distributively. Second, they have an underpaying welfare state that these people don't have. Third, people don't have pensions across the world. Fourth, a lot of people who do have pensions invest in these specific oil companies might not be the people who are most suffering, while the government can be much more active in its redistribution. I cannot believe that they ran that. But finally, on this renewable stuff, you know what? It goes either way. Panel, we've shown to you that the tax incidence falls on these companies, that this is better for institutional investing, and also that this sets a better precedent. I'm very, very proud, folks.
All right. Thank you very much for that speech. We would like to invite the chief whip to tie up the debate.
Yes, I do realize Tin and I seem to go against this debate dog thing of you see stuff that's been thrown at you by the government and you bite it because you have to disagree with everything they're saying, which is why I read the motion like 5 different times to be sure I'm not the one who isn't paying attention. There are huge profits that are being made by these companies, because if there aren't, this motion does not apply and it doesn't matter and we can all go home, right? Given that those huge profits exist, and given that I've signaled in a POI to Naomi that this is what we will do, right? We will point out, we also probably think it's good to protect consumers. We just think that's not a good way to do it. There are better ways to do it. Naomi's response was, oh no, but the windfall tax is direct, targeted, and it harms those profiting. What Tin and I are telling you is that if that's what you want, there are other ways in which you can also apply policies that are direct, targeted, and harm those profiting, that achieve their goals better, which is why I think closing opposition should win this debate. Now, here's the thing. I don't think we are knifing OO simply because, again, if OO was trying to say that these companies aren't going to make huge profits, this motion wouldn't exist, because this is not about taxing revenues. This is about taxing profits. So what that means is that simply the fact that the price of crude oil has gone up worldwide doesn't mean that the companies that provide energy, because they're taking that oil and they're turning it into energy and sending it to consumers, they still want to make large profits because their costs have also increased, and they would simply be passing on those costs onto consumers. That's not profit, that's revenue, right? So what that means is that if we are talking about huge profits, it means that those companies, additionally to the increases that already happen anyway because their raw materials increase, they are able to massively profit off it, right? So like, OG and CG give you all kinds of various arguments on why there's tons of political capital to hit all companies to ease pressure on consumers. If that is true, great, just use it better. CG says, you know, governments can institute price caps, and they've kind of tried to do that. Like, they haven't really tried to do that, but I'm happy you think that's a thing they can do. What I'm telling you is take all of the political capital that you want to spend on windfall taxes. I'm telling you, windfall taxes aren't going to work as great as you think they will, and instead put it on price caps. What's the difference? Because I do feel dumb when Harish laughs at me, right? But I genuinely think I'm getting this right. Here's the thing. Windfall taxes means you allow the company to profit, meaning you allow them to put a huge markup on the things they are passing on to consumers, meaning the consumers need to pay those huge prices for the profit to be there in the first place. Then you take a small part of that pie of the profit, and you say you go give it back. It's kind of like looking at a hole in the Titanic, and instead of trying to plug the hole in the Titanic, you take a bucket and throw water out of it. Yes, you will throw water out of it with a windfall tax, like you take some of those profits and you can give it back to the people, but it's much smaller than the damage that is being done unless you tax those profits at literally 100%, which I just don't think is likely. And if you wanted to run that, you should have made that clear in PM. So here's the thing. We are telling you, instead of allowing those profits to keep rising and saying, you know, they're not that great, we want a share of that, we're saying don't allow them to make those profits in the first place. Why? Because the incentives of the companies aren't to minimize their tax bills. They're to maximize whatever is left after the tax. If I have the choice between earning $1 million and paying $100,000 in tax because you tax me more because I'm rich, I would much prefer that over only earning $100,000 in total, and then, you know, I still maybe only pay $1,000 in tax, and like that's a much lower tax rate, it's a much lower overall tax bill, but also the size of the pie that I'm left with after those lower taxes is smaller. Meaning that if you have windfall taxes, companies are still going to choose to maximize profits as much as they fucking can, because what taps them currently is the price they're able to get on the market, and the fact that there's very low elasticity of price for things like heating, because people need to heat. Like OG gives you all of that, right? So what that means is that when you need to intervene is those companies making those profits, rather than just saying, well, you know, we want a tiny size of that pie and maybe give it back to people. Yeah, actually, I'll take OG.
Okay, companies can't increase prices a huge amount, partly because they're already trying to maximize, as you were noting, and they will not just keep increasing profits to put the prices to the point where you have reduced demand. That is why you don't have the effect you were talking about.
But the problem is that the kind of profits that we are seeing, they are generally going to be the kinds of things that are realized in the moment. That is the first answer. And the second thing that I think is important here is you need to distinguish between the energy companies that are simply buying raw material. And okay, no, the other answer to Harish is basically that there's only so many reserves you can have. They're usually at a pretty much 100% anyway. And like when you fill them doesn't really matter. What matters is that when the price is high and you increase your profit margins, you're able to make profit. Because notice that if you buy that energy cheaper, that is reflected in your profit margins, because the profit is, again, the difference between what you buy and what you sell. So that doesn't even make sense, Harish. But because that would be then reflected, and then if we stop you from having those profits, then that is great. But then what we also need to pay attention to is that probably what makes a difference is also where those profits are being made. Because if you're trying to target extractors, like good luck targeting like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or Russia with windfall tax, it's not going to happen, right? So what that probably means is that if you want to target those companies making a shit ton of profits because they are extracting their own resources and storing it and selling it on the global market when the global market price is high. I genuinely don't think you can prove that Russia is going to implement the windfall tax for their companies, or that Saudi Arabia will do that, right? So then the only way you can target them is you target them at the moment where they introduce that thing on the global market, which is what we've seen you trying to do. Like, it pushed a shit ton of money to Russia, even though, trying to threaten they will no longer buy gas from Russia. But the only moment in which Russia's profits actually started to hold and Russia's economy actually started to take a hit is when you put a price cap on how much they are willing to pay on Russian oil. We are telling you that that is something that we have seen work, and it is something that we should continue to have. But second, the main delta here, and because that's where you realistically have some sort of influence, are the local energy companies that are profiting, that are literally making billions. Like, it's, I don't know the names in the UK, right? But there's like the Vienna Energy Company that had literally billions in profit last year. And it's not because they didn't always have like 100% reserves that they fail whenever the price is low. It's simply because they were able to push the prices higher. And if you tax that, if you prevent those profits from being made, that is when you get everything that Tin is telling you of. You get lower inflationary pressures because you get lower spikes in consumer goods prices. You also get, because you get lower inflation, then you also get lower hikes in tax rate, which means debt doesn't become that much more expensive, which means that you just make the problem smaller instead of like finding the inefficient way to solve it. Very proud to pose.
All right, thank you all very much for what was a lovely debate. We'll see you in 15 minutes.